Hey, good people. So I heard a rumor that William Shakespeare lived in Marion County, Florida. But is the rumor true? Or just another local legend? No, sorry, this rumor is not true. Mr. Shakespeare, who has been dead since the 1600s, might live on in Marion County, or at least he did at one time. I'm sure you've heard of Shakespeare's tale of two tragic lovers and their rival families. Romeo and Juliet ring a bell? So that part is how Shakespeare lives on in Marion County, or at least he did at one time. You may recall in Shakespeare's play, Lord and Lady Montague are the parents of Romeo. So in a nutshell, Lord Montague is feuding with the head of another rich and important household, Lord Capulet. Many fights in the city resulted from this rivalry, and Romeo ends up getting banished from the city for killing Juliet's cousin Tybalt during a street fight after crashing the Capulet's party when he knew he wasn't welcome there. Juliet was set to marry Paris, her father's choice, but Romeo and Juliet share a kiss at the party and instantly fall in love, only to find out later that their families are rivals. But Juliet wanted to be reunited with Romeo, so in her desperate attempt, she follows the Friar's plot and fakes her own death. Paris visits the Capulet family tomb to pay his respects to Juliet when Romeo shows up to meet Friar Lawrence after being given word to be at the tomb. The boys fight, and Romeo ends up killing Paris. See, Juliet had taken a sleeping potion to pull off her fake death and had not awoken yet, but Friar failed to get the letter to Romeo explaining the plan. So when Romeo finds her, believing her to be dead, he kisses her and then drinks potassium cyanide poison, thus killing himself. Juliet wakes up and discovers Romeo deceased, so she kisses his lips and says, "Thy lips are warm." She had hoped the poison on his lips would kill her too, but that didn't work. So she grabbed Romeo's dagger and stabbed herself to death. Lady Montague ends up dying of grief over the loss of her son, and Lord Montague decides to end the feud between the two families once and for all after finding the tragedy at the Capulet's tomb. So how does this tie into Marion County, Florida? Well, a little more than a century ago, there were two flourishing communities in Marion County called Montague and Capulet. Sound familiar? So let's call Montague the area where Romeo's family lived, and Capulet was the home of Juliet's clan. They each lived on opposite sides of what was later Mary Camp Road, which is close to Baseline Road and east of Ocala. Welcome to my two-part series about Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet turned Florida ghost towns. In this video, I will introduce you to the two rival families of Capulet and Montague, which seem to be the beginning, or maybe the inspiration behind, Florida's ghost towns of Romeo and Juliet. Or were they? In next week's video, I will introduce you to Romeo and Juliet plus the bonus ghost town of Gator. So Marion County's Montague and Capulet were sister communities, unlike the rival Veronese families in the play, according to the late local historian Sybil Browne Bray in her Salty Crackers series number 4 Capulet section published in 1985. She said she became aware of the sister communities Capulet and Montague early in her research, and that the two were named by S.S. Savage, the paternal grandfather of Charles Savage Jr. She said he had been a self-educated man that was very well read and loved Shakespeare. Savage's son, Charles III, only confirmed that his father was born in Capulet and lived there, but he has no idea why his grandfather selected those names. Capulet had a church and a school, but never had a post office. They always picked up their mail in Montague, which was a small, mostly black settlement about a mile away. Now, Capulet has never been seen on any maps, but we can guess the approximate location of this community based on the current location of the Capulet Cemetery off of State Road 464 near Baseline Road. There used to be a church next to the cemetery, but it was destroyed by a tornado in 1928. People that witnessed the tornado reported that the church's main portion was just picked up from the floor and carried several hundred feet before being set down again. But the pews were completely undisturbed, and the Bible on the pulpit even remained undisturbed by the tornado. My visit to Capulet Cemetery was so peaceful. It's one of the prettier cemeteries I've visited, set back in the woods off the main road. Its grounds make it seem like a bigger cemetery than it actually is, but there aren't many marked graves there. It left me wondering how many unmarked graves there are. Where was the church sitting, and how big was the community of Capulet? The cemetery is surrounded by woods. I'd bet the community wasn't any bigger than the size of a city block today, but who knows? As I walked through the cemetery, I noticed that the surrounding chain-link fence was quite mangled in several areas. There were a few trees that had dropped large branches to the ground, and I'm assuming the fence was damaged so much by falling trees and branches. Florida does get a lot of storms. Anyway, the mangled fence was really the only thing that seemed to bother me while I was there. I didn't feel, hear, or see anything out of the ordinary while I was there, just some nature-covered graves of some long-forgotten Florida pioneers mixed in with some newer graves and military veterans. I am a bit sad that there isn't much information on the town of Capulet. It seems the cemetery is the only evidence that this community even existed, and I find that disheartening as it's another chapter of Florida's history that seems to have all but disappeared. So, let's talk about Montague. Montague is now a suburban neighborhood located in Ocala, Florida with a population of 1,000. It reportedly had a population of 100 with turpentine and a general store and a business directory for 1911 through 1912, according to the Florida Gazetteer. There's hardly a trace of Montague today, but of course, there is a cemetery. There's always a cemetery. So some arbors were developing a tract of land south of Maricamp Road one day and found two graves, sitting side by side, buried in brambles and thicket because nature. These graves belong to Reverend John Brooke Pinney and his wife Ellen Agnes Seward. Thus begins our history journey for Montague. So it seems that Montague was a small black community. Some believe it began in Marion County's early years by freed slaves. Montague had a post office that opened in 1886 and was discontinued in 1915. Well, it turns out that John Brooke Pinney was the grandson of Lieutenant Abraham Pinney, who fought in the British at Lexington in 1775 as part of the Connecticut 18th Regiment. Mr. John Pinney was born in Baltimore, Maryland on Christmas Day of 1806 and was sent to live with his grandfather. But he entered the Windsor Academy at the ripe old age of 10 years old to prepare him for college and graduated in 1828 from the University of Georgia. He followed his father in the law field, being admitted to the Georgia bar. However, much to the dismay of his father, Mr. Pinney discovered a new calling at a revival while he was a senior at Georgia University. He was going to be a missionary in Africa. His father disowned him for this, and Pinney paid for his minister training at Princeton Theological Seminary by teaching for a year in South Carolina. And when he was ordained in 1832, he was selected to be the first Presbyterian missionary to Africa. So he joined the American Colonization Society, which seemed to be establishing a haven in Liberia for freed and escaped slaves that wanted to go back to Africa. Now, there is some debate about the true motives of the society, and I'm not going to get into them here. We simply don't know what Reverend Pinney's knowledge, experience, or beliefs were at the time, and it's not fair to make assumptions. I'd like to believe that he thought it inhumane to forcibly take people from their homelands to put them into bondage. Reverend Pinney set sail aboard the brig Roanoke on January 1st and arrived in Monrovia 42 days later. He had a rough go of it over in Liberia, though, what with fever and rain, but he was able to explore somewhere around 200 miles of the colony, mostly on foot, during his time there. He became governor of the colony when the Colonization Society appointed him as agent in October. But his 20 months as governor were hard too because he had repeated bouts of fever and the immigrants were becoming increasingly restless, causing grave setbacks to the missionary work among the native tribes in Liberia. When he returned to the States in August of 1835, he was depressed and severely ill, but he would end up making at least 4 additional trips to Liberia. He eventually recovered and married Ellen Agnes Seward of Savannah in September 1836 and then produced 10 children, 4 of whom passed in early childhood. It's believed that his wife may have been related to Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State, William H. Seward, but I was unable to confirm this. Coincidentally, Panay represented Liberia's interests in the United States as Consul General after Stephen Benson, Liberia's president, appointed him. The appointment was recognized and signed by President Lincoln and Secretary Seward on November 14, 1862. Panay served in this role until 1865. After this, he tried several methods of supporting his family, including operating a cotton plantation in Arkansas, silver mining in Nevada, and farming in Nebraska. But army worms ruined the cotton plantation, and the severe weather in Nebraska was too much for his wife, Ellen. So he ended up returning to visit the Liberia College in Africa. He had helped develop the college in the mid-1800s in Monrovia, and he wanted to check on its progress. But he found that the college was severely dilapidated, and there were only 7 students enrolled. He returned in 1878 as a final visit to find the conditions hardly improved, and since the college president resigned while he was there, he agreed to take on this new role. He convinced the Liberia legislature to move the college near the St. Paul's River, where there were richer farming lands, but it ended up getting vetoed by the Republic's president, James S. Paine. However, all of Panay's recommendations were eventually adopted, and today, the University of Liberia is the oldest degree-granting institution in Western Africa and is thriving near the government center in Monrovia. There's actually a stone plaque in Northcote that was installed in 1958 honoring Panay and marking the 125th anniversary of his missions to Liberia. So after all of that, Reverend Panay decided to move to Florida in 1879 to retire in weather that was nice enough for his wife Ellen. He purchased 240 acres of hammock and palado pine land from one Mr. John F. Dunn, who we'll talk about a bit later. He called his land Montague Groves, where he grew oats, sugarcane, sorghum, and cotton. For those that don't know, sorghum is the 5th most important cereal crop after rice, wheat, maize, and barley. It's commonly used to feed livestock and also as a food grain for folks in Asia and Africa. It's non-GMO and gluten-free. So Reverend Panay spent his final years working the land he bought for his wife. Their presence in Montague is confirmed by the 1880 census rolls for Marion County. He didn't just work the lands, though. He also built a one-room school with a kitchen and taught both children and adults during the week and then preached to them on Sundays. During this time, Montague was a small community of about 16 families that all helped each other. There was a general store and a post office until 1915. The Southern Florida Railroad between Ocala, Ocklawaha, and Wildwood also had a stop in Montague. Reverend Panay died at 3 a.m. on Christmas Day of 1882 on his 76th birthday. His family and a minister from Ocala that presided over his funeral were the only whites in attendance. The rest, including all 6 of his pallbearers, were blacks among the community. According to his family, Reverend Panay spent most of his life trying to right a wrong, and his final moments above ground were as he would have wished it. Reverend Panay and his wife's graves were located by neighborhood kids around Halloween, and the Homeowners Association allocated $5,000 to clear their grave sites and spruce them up. Now, their graves are well maintained within a gated community and could be seen as a tribute to a guy that dedicated his life to God, America's freed slaves, and the tiny colony that would become the Republic of Liberia. And these 2 graves are the little that's left of old Montague. So we can only assume that the ghost towns of Capulet and Montague were inspired by Shakespeare's play of Romeo and Juliet. If you've come this far, you'll want to stay tuned for next week when I talk about the actual ghost towns of Romeo and Juliet to complete this romantic series. Thank you for watching. Like and subscribe if you'd like to see next week's video, and I will see you then.